Okay, now, as I was saying, yeah, I was going to go through this utility question. Okay, so firstly, whenever you look at utility questions, essentially words like useful, okay, they give you a clue um, that tells you that this question is a utility question. So the first thing you should always do is to ensure that you're very clear about the issue in the question. So in this case, take note of the word evidence. Okay, how useful is source F as evidence about what? So you need to take note that it's about the Soviet Union's intervention in Cuba. So ensure that all your answers directed towards this very issue. Okay, the Soviet Union's intervention in Cuba itself. Okay, so okay, I think I've mentioned that whenever you look at utility questions, you look at relevance, accuracy, and whether the source provides us with any insight. Okay, and these are the various levels. Essentially, the first level will be looking at the content of the source on its own. Okay, just the source on its own. And then when you move on to the next level, you get essentially you get the cross-referencing. Cross-referencing mark over here. And finally, you have purpose and tone. Okay, so essentially content, cross-refer, and then purpose or tone. Tone does not always apply to every source, but in general, sources do have a purpose. Okay, so you can normally tap on this aspect over here. Okay, so let's look at the source in itself when we deal with content. Okay, so firstly, is this source useful? Is the content of this source useful in telling us about the Soviet Union's intervention in Cuba? Is the content relevant, accurate, or insightful? Just the content itself. Okay, so what you realize is that what the source tells us about the Soviet Union's intervention in Cuba is relatively uh, okay relevant. Okay, in the sense that if you read the source carefully, it says that okay, this source is by President Kennedy. Okay, so the American president, and he was uh, having a private conversation with a U.S. historian in 1963. So what you realize is that the date over here, 1963, is just shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, in fact. Okay, and I think you need to know that historians, what do historians do exactly? So you need to have a clear idea. So basically, historians are people who essentially they study history, and they study sources, and they have they conduct interviews and things like that. And what they eventually do, a lot of them do is to publish, okay, history books. So when Kennedy had this conversation with this U.S. historian, chances are was that he expected this conversation to have some sort of impact in a particular book that this historian was going to publish later on, and he eventually did that. Okay, in 1965. Okay, which is important because essentially after Kennedy died in November 1963. Okay, so we look at the source. Does it tell us anything about the Soviet Union's intervention in Cuba to make it relevant? Okay, so if you read over here, Kennedy says, just very quickly, when one country is clearly wrong, it will eventually give way. That's what happened over Cuba. The Soviets had no business putting those missiles in and then lying to me. They were in the wrong and they knew it. So when we stood firm, they had to back down. But this doesn't mean at all that they would back down when they felt that they were in the right and had vital interests involved. So essentially, does this source tell us anything about the Soviet Union's intervention? It definitely tells us that the Soviet Union intervened. Okay, when it says here that is what happened over Cuba, the Soviets had no business putting those missiles in and then lying to me. So there are a few layers actually. If you look, okay, I'm going to use green in this case. Okay, essentially for relevance, okay, I'm going to use green. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so if we look at, okay, it does tell us that the Soviets intervened by doing what? Okay, in this case, by putting those missiles in. So we have one point over here that shows us that this source is relevant. So and also they uh, they were in the wrong and they knew it. Okay, they were wrong and they knew it. So the Soviets knew that their intervention was wrong, and also that they eventually, in acknowledging that they were wrong, had to back down. Okay, so when we look at the content itself, we realize that yes, the content basically what it does is to show us that this source is relevant, okay, and therefore useful in that very way. Okay, so what you can say is that okay, source F, okay, oops. Source F is useful in telling us about Soviet intervention in Cuba, as it tells us how the Soviets intervened in Cuba. It tells us that the Soviets intervened by placing missiles in Cuba as a form of intervention. Okay, and it states that the Soviets had no business putting those missiles in. Okay, so in this sense, yes, okay, you will get the mark over here because you did say that it's useful in telling us as evidence because it does tell us, it is relevant, right? It tells us how the Soviet Union intervened in Cuba and therefore addresses this issue in the question. Okay, or okay, essentially there is another way. It tells us it's also useful. Okay, source F is useful as it tells us. Okay, going to be more specific. You can say it's useful in telling us about Soviet intervention as it tells us that the USSR stationing of missiles in Cuba was misguided and ultimately unsuccessful, or okay, I would say fruitless. Okay, where do you get the evidence from over here? Misguided and ultimately fruitless. Of course, this part, they were in the wrong and they knew it. So therefore, it was misguided and they had to back down, removing the missiles, and therefore it was fruitless over here. Okay, so those are the two pieces of evidence. Source F states that the Soviets were in the wrong and they knew it and they had to back down. Okay, so it's useful because so in this case it's useful because it is relevant, therefore useful because it is relevant. Okay, so you see it over here, but however this will give you probably will give you an L2, okay, a level 2. Okay, because you're only comparing content. Okay, looking at the source on its own. Okay, next step, of course, you move on is to cross-refer to either your contextual knowledge or other sources. Okay, so if we look at other sources, for example, uh, we can compare what other sources say about Soviet Union's intervention in Cuba. So in this source, you realize that what President Kennedy says, I'm going to use purple. Okay, uh, President Kennedy said that the Soviets had no business putting those missiles in. Okay, so what does it tell us about the Soviet intervention in Cuba? Basically, what Kennedy seems to say is that the Soviets had no good reason to put the missiles in. Okay, when we compare to our contextual knowledge or to other sources, so let's look at another source. For example, we look at source C. Okay, and what you realize in source C is that it says here, the Soviet Union's military assistance is exclusively designed to improve Cuba's defensive capability. Okay, so what you see over here is it's a very clear contradiction of what source. Okay, so source C essentially says that the intervention was to defend Cuba, right? But when you compare to source F, right, and as we acknowledged, okay, source F says that the Soviets had no reason, right? It basically had no plausible reason, okay, no good reason, okay, to plant those missiles. Okay, so essentially there is a tremendous, very obvious contradiction between these two sources. Okay, so when we go back into the first one over here, okay, what you can say is that okay, so to move on to the next level, okay, you realize that, however, when I cross refer to source C, okay, okay, when you cross refer to source C, okay, I find that source F is limited in its usefulness as evidence about Soviet intervention in Cuba. Okay, so firstly we look at this part over here. Source, so you must explain, okay, you must explain over here. So explain what source F says. Okay, so source F states that the Soviets had no plausible or good reason to intervene in Cuba, as it mentions that the Soviets had no business putting those missiles in, right? However, source C contradicts, okay, or basically source refutes, okay, source F by stating that Soviet intervention was aimed at defending Cuba. Okay, and then you cite evidence. Okay, which I'm not going to do, but essentially you can find it over here. Okay, it states that Soviet Union's military assistance exclusively designed to improve Cuba's defensive capability. Okay? Can? So yeah, and therefore it's limited in its usefulness, which you already stated over here. Okay, if you want, you can add one more line. Therefore, as source C refutes source E, source F, source F is limited in its usefulness. Okay? And also, I mean, when you look at your contextual knowledge, what happens is that you also realize that, okay, your contextual knowledge also tells you otherwise, doesn't it? Because when when you cross refer to your contextual knowledge, okay, what your contextual knowledge will tell you is that yes, it was also the case, or that the Soviets put them there to yes, to defend Cuba after incidents like the Bay of Pigs. However, it also tells you that the USSR had political reasons, right? Reasons such as to gain prestige, right, in the as the communist leader. Remember, after the Sino-Soviet split, okay, to gain prestige as communist leader, also to counter the threat of Jupiter missiles. Okay, so these things that your contextual knowledge tells you basically goes against the fact that Kennedy over here says that the Soviets had no plausible reason to intervene in Cuba. Okay, so essentially your contextual knowledge also goes against what JFK, right, claims in source F, and therefore you realize that source F is again limited in its usefulness. Okay, I hope this is clear. I mean, you can write in your own words, but I hope the idea is clear to you. And finally, when we look at purpose over here, which is So what we did by looking at the cross-reference part was that we found out that when we cross-refer to our contextual knowledge and to other sources, you realize that it basically tackles the issue of accuracy. And based on our contextual knowledge and other sources, we realize that what Kennedy says in this source over here is not accurate. And when something is not accurate, okay, essentially it is not useful. Okay, an inaccurate source definitely affects or limits the usefulness of a source. So although it was relevant, it is not entirely accurate and therefore not entirely useful. Okay, and finally we look at purpose. Let's see what its purpose does. In this sense, when you think about a purpose, what does Kennedy want to do? So we look at the message. Okay, what is the message behind the source? Okay, so we look at the message. It's basically to show that the Soviets. Okay, remember the Cuban Missile Crisis was just over. Of course, what Kennedy will be trying to do? Oh shucks. Okay, is to show the Soviets, right, to be in a certain light. Okay, so if you look carefully, okay, basically you know that it's a history book. Okay, it's going to be published. So what Kennedy want to do is to defend, right, his legacy and his handling of the CMC. Okay, and therefore and also what he does is to give the USA's perspective. Okay, so it's a limited perspective already. So this is the purpose. If you look at it over here, and you need to further explain, okay, why he had said what he had to say. And what did he say? So that would fall under message. And basically what he said was that the Soviets were at fault, right? And were responsible. Okay. Okay, so the Soviets were at fault and were responsible for the Soviet intervention. Okay, so basically it was not justified. The Soviets were wrong in intervening in Cuba. Okay, but if you realize what this helps to do, the audience, of course, it's a general audience, or if you want to be more specific, you can also general public, because the book's going to be published. But you know, or you can also, if you want to say, you can just say readers. Okay, readers of the book, for example. An outcome. What kind of outcome will intended outcome will Kennedy want to achieve? Okay, so what he does is basically to justify, right, his decisions, the decisions he made during the crisis itself, and because he wants to, the keyword here is justify his decisions during the Cuban Missile Crisis. What happens is that he is trying to make, okay, which is the intended outcome over here, make the audience do what? Okay, of course to adopt a favorable impression, right, of the USA or of JFK, okay, and support his perspective. Okay, so this is the intended outcome. And because of that, how does that affect the accuracy or maybe the relevance or insight? In this case, because he's trying to justify his own decisions to get people to support his perspective, you realize that his account would therefore be one-sided, right? He wouldn't paint the USA in negative light. He would only be very one-sided in his interpretation. And when it's one-sided and biased, okay, of course biased towards the USA, right? Because to paint a negative picture of the Soviets, that they had no reason to intervene at all. So what the Americans did was essentially right. It's very one-sided and biased towards the USA. So you think if a source is one-sided or biased, how does that affect its usefulness? So essentially you realize that because it's one-sided and biased, of course, again, the source will be limited in its usefulness in telling, okay, or as evidence about the Soviet Union's intervention in Cuba. Okay, so whenever you tackle questions like that, make sure that you read the source carefully, you read the questions carefully, highlight the keywords, okay, the issue and the question. Okay, look at the three main steps: content, cross-refer, and purpose. Think about relevance, whether the content is relevant. Think about after you cross-refer, how does that affect the accuracy of the source. And in general, when the source's accuracy is compromised, its utility or its usefulness will also be compromised. Again, finally, so what we did was to find out that essentially what happened was that based on its purpose and tone, we realized that its one-sidedness affected its accuracy, or it gives us limited insight. Okay, because it only gives us insight into the American perspective. It doesn't tell us anything about the Soviet reasons, the real Soviet reasons for planting the missiles in the first place. So because the purpose over here of basically it doesn't give us an accurate picture, okay, and doesn't only provides us with limited insight, it is limited in its usefulness. Okay, if you have any questions, you can look for me on Tuesday. Thank you.